David, you mentioned some of the scientific evidence for God. You've talked about the fine-tuning of the universe. How would atheistic scientists respond to that sort of argument?
I think one of the responses would be to say, with regard to something like fine-tuning, well, we shouldn't be surprised to observe that the universe just happens to be suitable for life, because if it wasn't like that, well, we wouldn't be here to observe it. But this seems very weak to me. It's got things the wrong way around, because our existence can't provide an explanation for the fine-tuning. The whole point about this is that the universe is the way it is, and so life is possible. Now, to say that we are here doesn't explain that. What we want to know is, what's the explanation for it being like that in the first place? Okay, so it just misses out on the point of the problem, really, I think. So that's one line of response, but I think it's generally considered to be a rather weak one. I suppose I should also have said that, in principle you could say it's just down to chance. We just got lucky, but this won't really do either, because the problem is that it's incredibly lucky that we need to get for this, that it's just not feasible really to appeal to this kind of luck and an explanation. It's really just amounts to saying, well, we don't have any explanation. So probably, I suppose one of the most popular responses now from an atheistic perspective is to say that our universe is only one of many universes. So there are many universes, possibly infinitely many universes, and they all have slightly different parameters. So going back to the parameters being just right, well, if you look across all of these universes, some have one value, some have another value, and of course a tiny proportion of them, including ours, happen to have the parameters just right for life. Okay, and so if that's the case, well then just by chance, of course, you'll have a few of the universes that are suitable, and not surprisingly, we find ourselves in such a universe. Now, there are a number of problems with this kind of explanation. The biggest problem that most people have with it is that there's just no evidence for it. Most scientists find it difficult enough to try to account for the one universe that we live in. So if we throw in multiple universes, potentially infinitely many, well, what reason is there to believe in any of these other universes? So I think there's a real difficulty there. We seem to have a much simpler explanation of a creator who has intentionally created the universe, and we have independent evidence for that, drawing on some of the other scientific evidence I talked about earlier. So I think it's a much neater explanation. There's also, I think, a further difficulty that it's very hard to see how there could be any evidence for these other universes. At the very best, we could have some very indirect evidence for them. But really, it's very weak. There's nothing like that on the table at the moment. But there's an even deeper problem with it, and it gets back to one of the things that we talked about, that let's suppose we did somehow manage to have evidence for all these other universes. Well, arguably, a multiverse of that kind would require design itself, because such a multiverse would require the right kind of mechanism for generating all these universes. It would require the universes to have this whole range of parameters, so some way of generating that, some way of generating the energy for the universes in the first place. And for that all to work in such a way that would be guaranteed to have universes supporting life would require arguably design in this instance as well. So it doesn't really escape the issue here that design is required at some level for the universe.
Do we face a similar problem, or do atheists face a similar problem when it comes to the beginning of the universe? Some people talk about a time, or time's the wrong term, but something before, quotes, the Big Bang. Does a similar problem arise there?
I think it does. I think there's been a wide range of attempts to avoid a beginning to the universe and to propose alternative models. But what has generally been the case is that these alternatives quite often have been found to themselves require a beginning. So one of the ideas was a sort of cyclical view, where you would have a universe with a big bang and then a big big bounce, it would contract back in itself, and another big bang, another universe, and this would go on forever. But the more it was studied, what the conclusion they came to was that as you go back in time, you'll eventually go back to a beginning anyway. And indeed, there's been some recent work done by some leading cosmologists in this area, and they've presented very strong reasons for believing that basically all of the cosmologies on the table take you back to a beginning at some point. So yeah, I think that is a problem.
So when it comes to design fine-tuning, Richard Dawkins seems to have a very different response than to talk about many universes, and you've responded to this in your book Atheism's New Clothes. Could you begin by telling us exactly what Richard Dawkins' problem with a designer is?
That's a good question. I mean, Richard Dawkins does discuss some of the arguments that we've been talking about in terms of design, in terms of the beginning of the universe and so forth. But in most cases, he doesn't go into the detail of this. He doesn't really consider the merits of the arguments. It's a very quick dismissal. I mean, to take one example just on that, in terms of the beginning of the universe, he says, well, would it not be better to say that a Big Bang singularity did it rather than God did it? But this just misses the point, because the Big Bang singularity is precisely the problem from an atheistic perspective, because it marks the beginning of the universe. I mean, if we then take his response to design, because this is something, and I think he's presented an interesting argument. I think there are loads of flaws in it, but I think he's presented an interesting argument in terms of trying to respond to design. And his take on it is basically this. What we're trying to do with the design argument is we start with something complex that requires explanation, he would say. I suppose he's thinking primarily about biology, but it applies to the other examples of design as well. And we want some explanation of this complexity. And so he says the problem here then is bringing in God. That if you bring in God to account for this, actually you're worse off than where you were when you started, because God is, by definition, even more complex than what you started out with. So bringing in God is no help. And so he basically, on these grounds, rules out God as an explanation. You should never, in these kinds of discussions, appeal to God as an explanation. This notion of complexity, it's basically an idea that Dawkins himself talked about in his earlier book, The Blind Watchmaker, the idea of organised complexity. So something like an eye, the human eye, has organised complexity, or another example he gives is a Boeing 747. And the idea in both cases is that you have some system that's comprised of a variety of different interacting parts, which are all arranged in a highly specific manner so that it can function properly. So if all the components of the eye weren't arranged in the right way and working properly, the eye wouldn't function, we wouldn't be able to see. Similarly, a Boeing 747, if it weren't arranged in the right way, all the different components working together in the right way, then it wouldn't be able to function, it wouldn't fly. Well, so far that's fine, but then the key part, I suppose, of Dawkins' argument is to link this with improbability. So his idea here is that things that have organised complexity are very improbable. And at one level that seems right. If we take the eye, he argues that it's very improbable that an eye would come into existence just by chance. Or if we take again the Boeing 747, well, you imagine a whirlwind passing through a scrapyard. What's the chances of it just by chance assembling a Boeing 747? Well, that's just so improbable that it's laughable. Okay, it couldn't be seriously considered. So this is his idea, that things that have this organised complexity are very, very improbable indeed.
And he would agree that these things with organised complexity have the appearance of design.
Yes, he would. He would say that, you know, he wouldn't be impressed with arguments that are saying, well, there's just nothing to be explained here. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's one of his motivations for science and for biology in particular, is to provide an explanation for organised complexity. So Where the problem, I think, lies, or one of the problems, because I think there are a number of really serious problems with this kind of argument. And one of the problems is this link between organized complexity and improbability. Taking again the example of the Boeing 747, we can certainly agree with him that it's very improbable that will come about by chance. But then he translates this into his discussion about God. He says, well, if there's a God, he would have organized complexity, and so he would be very improbable. But note that it's only if God came about by chance that he'd be very improbable. And of course, nobody believes that anyway. So the argument fails at that hurdle. But it also fails for a deeper reason as well. Does God have organized complexity? Or, from Dawkins' perspective, if God existed, would he have organized complexity? Now, Dawkins' argument for this is based on the idea that God would be able to do all sorts of amazing things. He would have amazing knowledge. He would know everything that's going on in the universe. So he must be incredibly complex. But remember, for his argument to work, it's got to be linked with organized complexity. And so the question then is, well, does God possess organized complexity? That is he composed of a variety of interacting parts that are organized in just the right way for God to function properly? Well, he certainly doesn't give us any reason for thinking that God is like that. What are these parts that God is composed of? There's just no argument here. And in fact, the Christian notion of what God is like, as God being the creator of the universe, being a non-physical being, an immaterial mind, well, these arguments don't apply. They apply very well to things like eyes or to physical machines. But to try to apply them to God, it just fails, because God is not that kind of being. So basically, there's no good reason to believe that God has organized complexity. And so the argument just, I think, fails on that front as well.
David, you mentioned Richard Dawkins' response here to design arguments. At times, Richard Dawkins would seem to concede that he could maybe have time for the God of the physicists, the God who can explain the laws of nature, the God who can explain fine-tuning. But he seems to have a real problem with the God of revelation. Is there any particular reason why somebody should believe, say, in the Christian God, as opposed to just a great designer out in the never-never?
Well, I think when it comes to looking at Christianity in particular, then I think we've got to try to assess first of all, consider what the claims of Christianity are, and then see if there's any good reason to believe that the central claims of Christianity are true. And so what I would want to do here would be to look at what is right at the heart of Christian teaching, and that is, of course, the person of Jesus. Now, one of the things about this, when we start thinking in terms of Jesus, is that these are historical claims. So these are claims that we can assess. We can look at the evidence and see whether they stand up to scrutiny or not. And we can look into that. And I think probably the most important thing, certainly Christians would claim this, that Jesus, after he was crucified, rose on the third day. Now, is that true or is it false? If it's false, according to the Apostle Paul, then Christianity's false. It's something that achieves nothing. It's all in vain. And so I think that's where I would go in terms of Christianity. I would look at that central claim as to whether it is reasonable to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And I would say it is. I think the evidence for this claim actually stands up very well to scrutiny.
What sort of evidence would you be thinking of there?
Well, I think there's a number of things to consider. I think when we look at the historical claims, and I mean, when we look at Richard Dawkins and the New Atheism with regard to this, they're inclined just to throw out the whole thing. And really, this is just going against historical evidence regarding Jesus in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that we can simply take the Bible and prove every statement in it or something like that. But when we look at the historical Jesus, I mean, Richard Dawkins raises a question mark over the existence of Jesus. And this is just not any doubt at all on historical grounds. And indeed, the crucifixion. I mean, these things are just established way beyond any doubt whatsoever. But in terms of the resurrection specifically, what I would say is, well, again, looking at this notion of the broad range of evidence, what's the best explanation for the evidence? And so the kinds of evidences that I would refer to here would be things like the fact that the tomb was empty. It was discovered to be empty. I think that's the evidence for that is very well established. This is, we could look at various bits of evidence relating to that. But also the fact that the followers of Jesus believed that they had seen him alive again shortly afterwards. There were these appearances. Now, I'm not saying the evidence is that they actually saw Jesus. Of course, that would be begging the question. But they believed that they had seen him alive again. And this, again, is just far too well established to be ignored. And I'm not aware of anybody who looks into the history of this who denies that these appearances occurred, that they believed they had seen Jesus. One of the reasons for this is because in the New Testament, again, it's not just accepting the Gospels at face value or something like that, but when we look at what Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians 15, he's making use of an early creed that goes right back to within a few years of the crucifixion itself. And so right back in these earliest Christian claims were the claim that they had seen Jesus after his death. Now, furthermore, they not only believed they'd seen him, but they believed he was resurrected. They didn't describe this as a vision or something like that, which would have been quite easy for them to do. They believed in this as a physical resurrection. And indeed, we see a complete transformation. We see the start of the Christian church starting off in Jerusalem, in the very place where Jesus has been crucified a few days afterwards. And when we take into account the fact that it started amongst a group of Jews for whom somebody being crucified was God's curse. This was going to be the end of any movement for somebody to be crucified. And so another factor that we have to take into account, another piece of evidence, is why did this group of devout Jews start worshipping somebody who was under God's curse, who had been crucified? And so those are a few of the bits of evidence. In the book, I outline, I think it's 16 bits of evidence, just well-established historical facts. And then the key question is, what's the best explanation for all this evidence? And I would say far and away, the best explanation is the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead.
But would that not leave it, again, going back to your career as a scientist, mathematician, you're saying that a miracle occurred? I mean, can a physicist believe in miracles? Can he believe that God breaks the laws of nature? Is that possible?
I think when we think about what science is doing, what physicists are doing when they tell us about the laws of nature, well, this is telling us how the world works, how it works normally. But is there any reason at all why, if there's a creator, the creator of the universe couldn't decide to do something different on occasion? I mean, of course, if there's no God, then well, I would agree. It would be crazy to believe in a miracle if there's no God. How could that happen? So if we were trying to assess this and we had no reason whatsoever to believe in God, then I think a high degree of skepticism would be warranted here. But if there are good reasons for belief in God, and I've suggested that there are quite a number of good reasons for belief in God, then things are different. And this is a point, actually, that the Apostle Paul made himself. He said, well, why should any of you think it incredible that God raises the dead? So if there's no God, of course, it would be unreasonable to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But if there's a God, things are different. And so from a Christian perspective, then, I would say that science is telling us what is going on normally. But that doesn't prevent any barrier to the idea that God could do something different.
Would it not? But some people might respond and say, well, people make up tall tales all the time. Wasn't it more probable that in the case of the resurrection, appearances, that this is just a tall tale that the early church came up with? Is that, in terms of probability, is that not more likely?
Well, so if we take probability into the picture, I think we've got to distinguish two things. We've got to distinguish the probability before we take the evidence into account and the probability after we've taken the evidence into account. So, you imagine, if you've done the lottery, right? I mean, before I have any evidence, well, what's the chances that you have won the lottery in a given week? Well, of course, it's negligible. But if you come round to my house and you bought a new car and you're throwing your money about and all the rest of it, well, now the evidence is different. And, if you appear in the newspaper and so forth, well, I've got all this different evidence saying that you have won the lottery. And on the basis of that evidence, well, of course, it's reasonable to believe, even though it was highly improbable to start with. So, before we consider the evidence for the resurrection, we could say, well, what's the probability of this happening? And I would then be inclined to agree. Well, it's very low. I mean, even taking into account belief in God, you just don't go around believing in resurrections taking place all the time. So we could agree with that. Maybe some other explanation would be possible. It's just a story that people made up. But once we take the evidence into account, those sorts of bits of evidence that I was talking about, then things change dramatically. What I want to ask is, what's the probability of the resurrection after we've taken all the evidence into account? And I would say that the probability is now very high. I mean, of course, we can't put numbers on these things, but I would say that the evidence counts very strongly in favour. And that's not just because the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is a very good explanation for all the evidence, but it's also because all the naturalistic explanations are hopeless. I mean, they just don't account for the evidence at all.
So, for example, the naturalistic explanation, do you have any examples there?
Well, one that was proposed, historically, was the idea that perhaps the disciples stole the body. Okay, and that somehow this is how Christianity got started. Now, I don't think you'll find anybody these days, certainly not an historian, who will try to defend this kind of hypothesis. And the reason for it is not because, everybody just believes the Bible and takes it at face value, but it's just that this hypothesis doesn't account for the evidence. Let's suppose that is in fact what happened, that the disciples stole the body. Well, then how would it come about that? Well, it only accounts for one bit of evidence, that is the empty tomb. It doesn't account for these appearances. It doesn't account for the origin of the Christian faith. And so it doesn't account for multiple other pieces of evidence. And furthermore, the idea that, that the disciples then, who had deliberately made this up, they deliberately started Christianity or something like that. Well, again, this doesn't stand up to scrutiny based on the characters of these people, because, again, we've good historical knowledge about the fact that many of these people were willing to die for their faith. Nobody disputes the fact that they were genuine in their belief, and yet if it's all based on a lie. So this hypothesis is gone. Another one is that Jesus didn't actually die, that somehow he wasn't quite dead, and that he revived later, and so on. But again, this has been rejected, and the very simple reason for this is that, again, that it simply doesn't account for the evidence. How could this half-dead man, who somehow just about recovers and escapes death, how could he convince everybody that not only had he survived, but that he was the risen Son of God who had defeated death? It just doesn't account for the evidence at all.
So we've talked a lot about evidence here, and evidence for believing in God, evidence for believing in the resurrection. But surely faith doesn't have anything to do with evidence. Surely if you've got faith, you don't want to think about evidence, you don't want to take evidence into account. I mean, how can a man of faith, think so much about evidence?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think there's a big misunderstanding about what faith is. And one of the things that we find in the new atheism is that faith, their definition of faith, as you like, is believing something for which you've no evidence. And if that's the right understanding of faith, if that's what faith is, then of course you're right. The whole point about having faith would be not having evidence. And so it would just be a complete mistake to try and find evidence for faith. But that's not what Christian faith is. And one of the interesting things is that although the new atheists propose this definition, they just haven't done their homework on this. I mean, Christian writers have written extensively about what they understand by the nature of faith, and they don't all agree on it either. But to simply say that it's belief without evidence just fails to do justice to all of what Christians have written about the subject. I mean, the way I suppose I would think about faith is that faith is about trusting a person. In this case, it's about trusting God. And whether it's reasonable to have faith, whether it's reasonable to trust in God, then depends on who you're trusting. It depends on God. It depends on the character of God. It depends obviously on whether God exists. So whether it's rational to have faith, then we've got to try to answer those questions. And if there are good reasons for believing in God, then I think there are good reasons for putting our trust in God as well. And this is true at a human level too. I mean, whether I trust another person depends, or should depend, on whether that person is in fact trustworthy. And so if I have good reason to believe that the person is trustworthy, then I can have faith in the person. So I think it's very important in these kinds of discussions and debates to distinguish the sort of new atheist notion of faith from a properly Christian understanding of faith.